My own son slapped me across the face because the rice was burned. The sting on my skin was sharp, but the deeper wound was knowing the child I had sacrificed everything for now saw me as worthless. I stood frozen, my blood cold, the kitchen spinning around me as the plate shattered on the floor. In that single moment I felt humiliation, rage, and clarity intertwine. He thought he had silenced me with violence. He didn't know he had awakened something far more dangerous inside me. And now I want to know, where are you watching my story from? It was a Sunday evening, the kind of evening I once associated with warmth, laughter, and the smell of food filling a home that had always been mine to hold together. I wore an old apron, frayed at the edges, its faded pattern a relic of decades of service. The rice had stuck to the pot while I was distracted by a memory of simpler times. To me, it was nothing. To him, it became an excuse to unleash contempt. Aaron's eyes blazed with a cruel impatience, his jaw tightening until the muscles quivered. He muttered, "You can't even cook right anymore," as though I were not the woman who had fed him since the day he could chew. His hand rose and fell in a swift arc, connecting with my cheek in a sound that rang louder than any insult. The plate slipped from my fingers, exploded on the linoleum, and silence followed, heavier than the weight of his strike. I pressed my hand to my cheek, not to soothe the pain but to anchor myself in the reality of what had just happened. The kitchen, once a sanctuary of comfort and ritual, had transformed into a stage for betrayal. The clock ticked above the doorway, steady and unfeeling, as though mocking the end of my illusions. This was not the first time Aaron's words had cut me, but it was the first time his hand had declared open war. I looked at him, not with fear, but with an expression I kept carefully neutral. Inside, however, my thoughts raced with fire. I remembered every late shift I had worked, every meal I had stretched on pennies, every night I had walked home with aching feet, only to make sure he had what he needed. All those years condensed into one moment of clarity. He believed my silence meant surrender. He was wrong. As shards of porcelain glinted under the kitchen light and the smell of scorched rice filled the air, I realized something irreversible had taken root. The love of a mother had ended in that instant, replaced by something colder, sharper, and unyielding. Betrayal does not simply wound, it carves a new path, and mine had just begun. And now I want to know, where are you watching my story from? When I pressed my hand to my cheek that night, I felt more than the sting of his palm. I felt the collapse of decades. Aaron had not become cruel in an instant. This was the culmination of years where I blinded myself with hope, convinced that love and sacrifice would one day be enough. The slap was not the beginning of his betrayal. It was only the moment when I could no longer deny what had been building. I thought back to the years when he was small, when I carried him on my hip while folding laundry, or walked him to school through the Ohio winters with his hand tucked tightly in mine. After his father died, I worked 2 jobs to keep him clothed and fed. I came home with aching feet and raw hands from scrubbing pots, yet I still found strength to tuck him in and whisper promises that he would never go without. Those promises became chains. As Aaron grew older, gratitude faded into expectation, and expectation hardened into entitlement. He stopped asking, he started demanding. He borrowed money that was never returned, used my car until the tank was empty, and laughed when I asked for help with bills. He said, "Don't worry, Mom, I'll pay you back someday." But someday never arrived. Each small theft chipped away at respect until there was none left. There were warnings I ignored because I did not want to see them. Nights when he came home smelling of alcohol, eyes glassy with resentment. Times he slammed doors so hard the frames shook, muttering insults under his breath as if I were the problem in his life. I told myself it was stress, or youth, or grief he hadn't processed, but deep down, I knew those excuses were fragile masks for a truth I was afraid to face. The truth was simple and brutal. My son no longer saw me as his mother, but as his burden. He looked at me not with affection, but with disdain, as if every sacrifice I had made was his to dismiss. That night, as I sat in the kitchen surrounded by broken porcelain and burned rice, I realized that I had raised not only a man, but also the architect of my humiliation. And I had allowed it, one silence at a time. I tell you this not for pity, but for clarity. When betrayal grows slowly, it deceives you into thinking it is not betrayal at all. By the time you recognize it, the roots are already tangled deep. I had spent years watering a seed that grew into my own downfall, and now that I had finally seen the truth, I could never unsee it. This story is only beginning, and I want you to stay with me until the end. You will not want to miss what comes next. The morning after the slap, I woke with a face still tender to the touch, the bruise faint but visible in the mirror above the bathroom sink. It stared back at me like proof of everything I had denied for too long. I ran my fingers across the swelling and whispered to myself, "He did this. My son did this." That truth hit harder than his hand, and it could not be hidden anymore. I began noticing the patterns I had once brushed aside: letters from debt collectors stuffed into the mailbox, receipts from bars left carelessly on the counter, and cash missing from my wallet after nights when he stumbled home late. I had told myself these were small oversights, mistakes anyone could make, but they were not mistakes. They were a map of disregard, each clue leading me to the reality that Aaron had been carving out my ruin piece by piece. That evening, while he was out, I walked through the quiet of my house, seeing it differently than before. Every crack in the wall, every bill unpaid, every object broken, carried his fingerprints. My kitchen no longer felt like a sanctuary, it was evidence. I opened drawers, collected documents, and tucked them into a folder I hid beneath old linens. If my son thought I was blind, he would soon learn that silence was never the same as ignorance. When Aaron returned later, the smell of whiskey clung to him. He looked at me with the same casual disdain he always did and muttered, "Don't start with me, Mom. I've had a long day." I said nothing, only nodded, and let him walk past. On the surface, I appeared submissive, a mother too weary to argue. But inside, each word, each insult, was being catalogued, stacked like kindling for a fire that was already smoldering in my chest. I knew then that my revenge would not be born from a single act of rage, but from a slow and deliberate unveiling. I would gather proof, every debt, every insult, every bruise, and when the time came, I would make sure his cruelty stood in the light where no excuse could shield him. He thought my silence was weakness, but it was the sound of a trap being set. He would never see it coming. For now, I let the days pass as if nothing had changed, though everything inside me had shifted. I moved through my routines, cooking, cleaning, pretending. But behind the mask, I was watching, recording, and waiting. The slap had been his mistake, his arrogance exposing the truth. My response would be patient, precise, and devastating. And when it finally arrived, it would not be a mother's cry. It would be a reckoning. The days that followed were an exercise in disguise. On the surface, I resumed the same routines I had always maintained. I set the table, prepared his meals, and offered polite nods when he walked through the door. To Aaron, it must have seemed as though nothing had changed. But beneath the calm mask I wore, every gesture was deliberate. My silence was no longer submission. It was calculation, a stage carefully set for what was coming. I began keeping a small notebook, hidden in the folds of my old recipe box, a place Aaron never looked. In it, I recorded every slight, every insult, every night he stumbled home reeking of liquor. I documented the times money disappeared from my purse, the bruises he left in his rages, and even the lies he told neighbors when they asked about me. Each entry was a piece of a puzzle that would reveal the man he truly was. One evening, as I placed a plate before him, he sneered and said, "You're lucky I'm still here, Mom. No one else would put up with you." I met his eyes briefly, then lowered them as though his words had landed. Inside, though, I etched those words into my memory. He believed he had the power to humiliate me. What he didn't realize was that every cruelty he delivered only fueled my resolve to take that power away. I also began confiding in my sister Denise, though carefully. She had seen glimpses of Aaron's temper before and often urged me to take action. Over coffee at her small kitchen table, I told her fragments of the truth, never everything at once. Her eyes filled with concern, but she respected my silence when I said, "Not yet." She did not know I was building a case, brick by brick, and her patience gave me strength. The walls of my home had become both prison and weapon. Every creak of the floorboards reminded me of how confined I had been, yet every corner now served as witness to his behavior. I placed a small recorder behind the radio, its red light blinking faintly, capturing his drunken tirades when he thought no one was listening. Each word he spat became another nail in the coffin of his arrogance, evidence he would never be able to erase. By the end of that week, I no longer felt like a victim trapped in her own home. I felt like a hunter biding her time. The slap had been his declaration of war, but war is not won in a single strike. It is won through patience, through precision, through the gathering of proof, until there is nowhere left for the enemy to hide. My silence had transformed into strategy, and soon he would understand the cost of underestimating me. If you have ever hidden your strength behind silence, share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes the quietest storms are the ones that destroy everything in their path. The night came when I realized my notebook and recordings were not enough. Evidence, yes, but justice requires more than private proof. It requires exposure. I wanted Aaron's mask torn off in a way he could never recover from. He believed my silence meant safety, but I was crafting a stage where silence would transform into thunder. I began planning not for survival, but for victory. Every detail mattered, and I would not rush the strike. I contacted Denise again, this time with purpose rather than fragments. Over steaming mugs of tea, I explained my plan, the documents I had gathered, the recordings tucked away, the moments of cruelty I had catalogued. Her face tightened with both sorrow and resolve. She said, "Evelyn, if you are certain, I will stand by you." For the first time I saw not pity in her eyes, but recognition of the steel I had forged in secret. The next step was legal. Quietly, I visited an attorney Denise knew through church, a woman named Ms. Park. Her office smelled of ink and paper, walls lined with thick binders. I slid the folder across the desk, my hands steady. She listened, flipping through pages of receipts, notes, and photos. She said, "This is enough to act on. You are not powerless." The word powerless echoed in my mind, transforming into a fire that burned away years of submission. Returning home, I pretended nothing had changed. Aaron sprawled on the couch, scrolling through his phone, muttering curses at whatever debt collector had reached him that day. He didn't notice the shift in me, the way my shoulders straightened, the way my eyes lingered on him with the cold detachment of a strategist observing an enemy. He believed I was still the same mother he could slap and dismiss. His blindness was my shield, and I let him stay blind. But in private, I prepared the final act. I cleaned the dining table, polished the plates, and set aside the very pan he once mocked when I burned the rice. I would invite him to sit at that table, believing it was a dinner of reconciliation. In truth, it would be the stage where his downfall began. He would see Denise there, and Mrs. Whitaker, the neighbor whose ears had caught more than he knew, witnesses ready to hear the truth. That night, lying in bed, I could feel the plan shaping itself like a blade being sharpened. Each insult, each theft, each strike had become steel in my hands. I whispered into the darkness, "He thinks I am weak, but weakness is the mask I wore to survive. Soon he will learn the cost of underestimating the woman who gave him life. And when he learns, he will learn in front of everyone." The evening I chose arrived cloaked in false warmth. I set the table with care, laying out the dishes he favored as a boy, though now I cooked them with trembling purpose. The rice simmered perfectly this time, no hint of scorch, its steam curling into the air like a quiet signal. Every fork, every glass gleamed beneath the dim light, but beneath the polish lay something far sharper, my intent to strip him of power. When Aaron walked in, his tone was smug, as if reconciliation was a gift only he could grant. He looked at the table and smirked. "Trying to make up for the other night, Mom?" he asked, his words dripping with superiority. I lowered my eyes, masking the storm within me, and replied softly, "Sit down. Dinner is ready." He did not notice Denise entering moments later, or Mrs. Whitaker quietly taking a chair by the wall. He thought it was only me. We ate in silence at first. Aaron shoveled food with the arrogance of a man convinced he was in control. Then he spoke between mouthfuls. "You should be grateful, Mom. Without me, you'd be nothing." His words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. I set my fork down, lifted my gaze, and let my voice steady itself. "You think gratitude is owed to you? Gratitude dies when respect is buried." His laughter faltered, confusion flickering across his face. It was then I reached for the folder I had tucked beside my chair. The papers fanned out across the table like cards in a game he did not know I was playing. Receipts, notes, copies of debt notices in my name, photographs of bruises. His face drained of color. I pressed play on the small recorder, his voice filling the room with venom. "The neighbors don't matter. She's too weak to stop me." Silence swallowed the room whole. Denise's eyes hardened, her presence grounding me, while Mrs. Whitaker leaned forward, her jaw tight with disapproval. Aaron stammered, "Mom, this isn't what it looks like." But the proof surrounded him, undeniable, inescapable. I leaned closer, my voice low but sharp as steel. "This is exactly what it looks like. Every insult, every theft, every slap, here they stand in the light. You wanted me weak. Tonight I show you what weakness becomes when it finally awakens." Aaron slammed his fist on the table, desperate to reclaim control, but the sound no longer held power. It was a hollow echo against the walls that now bore witness to his unmasking. For the first time he looked small, cornered, stripped of his illusions. I sat straighter, my hands steady. I had waited years for this moment, and now it had arrived. His downfall had begun, and there was no path left for him to escape. The evening I had chosen arrived with deceptive calm. I cooked quietly, my hands steady as I measured rice, letting its steam drift through the kitchen. Every movement carried intention, the tablecloth smoothed, the plates polished, the glasses catching the low light of the lamp. To anyone else, it looked like an attempt at peace. But beneath the surface, each detail sharpened the blade of my resolve. This dinner would not heal, it would expose. When Aaron entered, he wore arrogance like a uniform. His eyes scanned the table, and then me, narrowing with suspicion. He asked, "So this is your apology?" I forced a faint smile, keeping my voice soft. "Sit, the food is hot." He pulled out his chair with a scoff and began eating as if the meal were his birthright. He never noticed the extra places set at the table, nor the quiet shuffle of footsteps outside the door. Moments later, Denise stepped inside, her expression calm but unyielding. Mrs. Whitaker followed, adjusting her shawl as she sat in silence. Aaron's fork clattered against his plate. "What are they doing here?" he demanded. My voice cut through the tension, low but steady. "They are here to hear the truth." He laughed, a hollow sound, and said, "You've finally lost it, Mom." But his laughter faltered when I slid the folder onto the table. The papers spread before him like shattered glass, receipts for debts, overdue bills in my name, notes I had written each time he struck or insulted me. His face paled. Then came the recording, his own voice pouring from the small device hidden near my plate. "She won't fight back. She's too weak." The words hung in the air, poisonous and undeniable. Silence filled the room, broken only by the sound of his breath quickening. Aaron's bravado cracked. He muttered, "This isn't real. You can't do this." But the evidence spoke louder than his denials. Denise met his eyes, her voice calm. "It's over, Aaron." Mrs. Whitaker shook her head, shame etched into her face. I leaned forward, letting my words slice cleanly. "This is the man you've become. The son I raised died long ago, replaced by someone who mistook cruelty for power. Tonight, I bury that illusion forever." He slammed his fist on the table, a desperate attempt to reclaim control. But the sound no longer carried weight. It echoed hollow against walls now filled with witnesses and truth. his shoulders slumped, eyes darting between us, realizing the fortress he thought he ruled had collapsed. I sat straighter, my body calm. For years he had mistaken silence for weakness. Now he was learning that silence had been my strategy, and tonight, it ended. The silence that followed my words was suffocating. Aaron sat frozen, his hand still clenched on the table as if he could hold power through sheer force. His eyes darted between Denise, Mrs. Whitaker, and me, searching for an escape that no longer existed. I watched the flicker of defiance in his gaze weaken into desperation. In that moment, I knew the illusion he had built around himself was finally shattering. His arrogance had nowhere left to hide. He tried to recover, his voice stumbling as he said, "You're twisting everything, Mom. None of this proves anything." But the tremor in his tone betrayed him. Denise leaned forward, her eyes sharp as steel. "It proves enough, Aaron. Your words condemn you more than any of us could." Mrs. Whitaker shook her head slowly, whispering, "I heard plenty through those walls, and now the world will hear too." His face flushed with the humiliation of exposure. I felt no pity as he squirmed under their gaze. For years, I had carried the weight of his cruelty alone. Now that burden was shared, and its weight dragged him down instead of me. He slammed his fist again on the table, but the sound was hollow, a desperate echo of the control he no longer held. I remained steady, my voice calm. "Every time you raised your hand against me, I stayed silent. Tonight, my silence ends." Aaron's mask cracked completely then. His shoulders slumped, his eyes flickering with something I had not seen in years. Fear. He said, "You can't do this to your own son." The words tasted bitter, even to him, because they no longer held the shield of innocence. I answered coldly, "A son is not defined by blood, but by loyalty. You forfeited that when you turned me into your victim." The truth had stripped him bare, and he finally understood the cost. Denise placed a hand on mine, her touch grounding me. She said softly, "You've done what needed to be done." Mrs. Whitaker added, "He'll never recover from this." I nodded, but my eyes stayed fixed on Aaron. I wanted him to feel the full weight of his downfall, to know that the mother he thought powerless had orchestrated his unmasking. His breathing grew shallow, his chest rising and falling with the panic of a man watching his empire crumble. I leaned back, my body steady, and let silence stretch between us. It was not the silence of fear anymore, it was the silence of victory. Aaron lowered his gaze, his fists unclenching as the last fragments of defiance drained from him. He sat not as a son, not as a man, but as a figure stripped of dignity. The room no longer belonged to him, it belonged to me, to truth, and to the vengeance I had finally claimed. If you've ever seen arrogance collapse into fear, share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes justice doesn't need to shout, it only needs to be seen. After that night, the house felt different. The same walls stood, the same furniture remained, yet the air had shifted forever. The silence that once suffocated me now carried freedom, though freedom came with its own weight. I walked through each room slowly, letting my hand trail along surfaces that had witnessed years of sacrifice and humiliation. This time I felt no shame. What once belonged to his temper now belonged entirely to me. Aaron left the next morning without a word. I heard drawers slam, the rustle of hurried packing, and then the front door shut with finality. He did not look back, nor did I expect him to. The absence of his presence was louder than any argument we had ever shared. For the first time in years, the floorboards did not groan under the weight of his anger. Instead, they carried only the sound of my own steady footsteps. In the days that followed, I found myself confronting memories I had tried to bury. I remembered him as a boy, eyes wide with trust, clinging to me after his father's death. I remembered the promises I made to him in whispered lullabies, promising safety I thought I could provide. Those memories cut deeply, but they also reminded me of a truth I could not ignore. Love given without respect becomes a weapon for the ungrateful. Denise visited often, bringing groceries and quiet company. One afternoon she said, "Evelyn, you look lighter." I smiled faintly, though inside I felt the heavy mixture of victory and loss. She was right. I was lighter without his shadow pressing on me, but victory is not without cost. I had lost the illusion of family, torn apart by betrayal, and gained solitude in its place. The exchange was bitter, but it was necessary. Survival always demands sacrifice. I also noticed how the neighbors looked at me differently, some with pity, others with admiration. Mrs. Whitaker stopped me one morning, her voice low. "You showed a strength most of us only dream of." I thanked her, but my heart carried no triumph. Strength, I realized, is not about glory, it is about endurance. It is about standing when every part of you has been told to kneel. My vengeance had given me dignity, but dignity cannot erase scars. At night, I sat by the kitchen table where it all began. The rice pot gleamed clean, the plates stacked neatly, the old wooden spoon replaced with a new one. I stared at these objects and understood they were no longer symbols of humiliation, but of survival. My son believed he had silenced me with his hand, but my silence had outlived him. Now it speaks louder than any words he could ever say. The final days after Aaron's departure were filled with a silence that no longer frightened me. It was not the silence of suppression or fear, but the silence of ownership. Each creak of the floor, each hum of the refrigerator belonged to me alone. I walked through the house and felt a sense of permanence settle over me. This home, scarred by betrayal, had survived, and so had I. One evening, I found myself standing at the window, watching the streetlights flicker across the pavement. Memories pressed in, years of sacrifice, the laughter of a little boy, the grief of widowhood, and the cruel hand of betrayal. I realized my story was not just about Aaron's fall. It was about my survival, about reclaiming dignity from the ruins of love twisted into something poisonous. Betrayal had carved its mark, but vengeance had written the final chapter. Denise asked me once if I regretted it. Her eyes searched mine, as though she expected to find doubt hidden beneath the surface. I told her plainly, regret belongs to those who wish for different endings. I do not. The ending I chose was necessary. It was not soft, it was not sweet, but it was mine. And that truth mattered more than any illusion of family I might have clung to. I sometimes think of Aaron, though never with longing. I wonder if he carries the memory of that night like a stone in his chest, or if denial shields him from the weight of it. Either way, it no longer belongs to me. His choices carved his destiny. My choice carved mine. I am not responsible for the ruins he built. I am responsible only for the strength I found in burning them down. Now when I pass by the rice pot, gleaming on the stove, I smile faintly. It no longer symbolizes shame or failure. It is a reminder that even the smallest spark, a burnt pot, a sharp word, a single slap, can ignite transformation. My story began with humiliation, but it ends with clarity. I am no longer the woman who endured quietly. I am the woman who rose, who fought, who survived. That is the legacy I leave behind. So I speak these words not as a plea, but as a testament. If betrayal has marked your life, remember this: silence does not mean surrender. Sometimes silence is the weapon sharpened in the dark, waiting for its moment to strike. My son thought he had broken me with one act of violence. He was wrong. He awakened me. And if my story has reached you, tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because survival deserves to be heard across every corner of the world.